Hi, and welcome to this knowledge clip about the selection and orientation of sensory panels. I will discuss what criteria are used to select panel members and what procedure is usually followed. But first, why do we actually need to select sensory panelists? Why can't we just pick people from the streets to form a panel? Well, of course, when we want to use a sensory panel, it needs to have people that are able to perceive and understand the sensory properties in food products. Sensory panelists need to be able to name and explain or discuss those sensory characteristics and can rate their intensity. These people have a sensory ability that is above average and can be trained to detect all the nuances in food products. But how do we find and select those people to include them in our panels? Well, to select people for a sensory panel, a selection procedure is followed, which consists of 4 basic steps. It starts with the recruitment of inexperienced people, and by performing tests and interviews, the selection pool gets smaller. In the end, only the people that perform best on all tasks will be selected to join the sensory panel. And I will go over this procedure step by step, starting with the recruitment phase. When you want to recruit people for your sensory panel, you have to make some considerations. First of all, you have to decide if you want to recruit people from inside or outside of your organization or company. It can be convenient to form an internal panel because the people are already there and familiar with your product. However, people from within the organization often have a lot of background information and may therefore be not so creative when it comes to attribute generation. Or they might even benefit from certain outcomes of sensory tests, which could create bias in your test results. An external panel consists of people from outside the organization and can come from any background. Next, you have to keep in mind what age you want your panelists to be. They need to be adults, but not too old, as aging may lead to a decline in sensory perception, especially for smell. To end up with enough panelists after the selection, it is best to recruit around twice the number of people that you need in the end, because about half of the people will not pass all the different selection tests. The second phase is a basic selection that can consist of an interview, questionnaires, and several tests to assess sensory ability. One goal of this phase is to evaluate the personality of a candidate. Good panelists should be team players with a positive attitude and not be too dominant. They should be good communicators, committed to their work, and be flexible. Lastly, you want to select people with cosmopolitan preferences, which means they are not picky or difficult eaters and are open to try new things. Candidates should be in good health and communicate any health restrictions such as missing teeth or medication use. All of this may affect their ability to taste and assess the products. Of course, you also want the panelists to be available when you perform your research, so they need to be flexible. During the basic selection phase, potential panelists need to be tested for their sensory ability. Such tests are typically focused on the recognition and ability to rank intensity of the basic tastes and on odor recognition and memory. Candidates also need to be creative in order to come up with different descriptors or attributes for the products. Lastly, you can choose to test for color blindness if that is relevant for your sensory panel or product. To perform the tests for sensory ability, there are several options. You could make solutions in different concentrations for all the basic taste qualities and have panelists taste, detect, and identify them. But as you can imagine, this is a lot of work, and some quick tests are commercially available. A rapid method for detection and recognition of the basic tastes is using the taste strips, which are paper strips that are impregnated with solutions of different concentrations of sweet, sour, salt, and bitter taste. The strips are presented in randomized order, and subjects have to indicate if they perceive a taste and which one it is. A rapid smell test is the UPSIT, a smell identification test. The test consists of 4 booklets with 10 scratch and sniff odors, and people have to indicate which smell they detect from 4 options per smell. Now we move on to the third phase, which is about task-oriented selection. In this phase, all candidates are familiarized to work in a sensory panel. This is necessary because the work does not simply involve tasting food products, but the way of working in a standardized laboratory setting might be a little artificial for people who have never done it. So people have to be familiarized with the test protocols, the different instructions, and the way of working for different sensory methods. They need to practice with discrimination testing or intensity scaling. If some people have difficulties in understanding the protocols, or they are not compliant to instructions, for example, this can be a reason to exclude them from the selection. Then, the final phase of the selection procedure, training of a descriptive panel. This last and perhaps most important phase contains more intensive training, not only of test protocols and way of working, but also on products and attributes. The goal is that specific sensory concepts become clear and understandable to the panel. Furthermore, training on intensity scales can be extended with the use of reference materials for intensity ratings. In this last phase, all selected panelists should be able to keep up with the training sessions and improve their performance for sensory evaluation. Important to note here is that this last phase of training is not a final thing. Instead, it is part of a continuous cycle of training, sensory evaluation, and performance monitoring to make sure the panel keeps performing well over time. You now know the different steps involved in panel selection and orientation, and probably realize that it requires quite some time and patience.